Hi, I'm John Ratzenberger. If you want to know America, you've got to meet the folks who work in factories and workshops.
People who make real things and take pride in what they do. And then you've got to go in there with them and see how it's done. So that's what I did. I poked around every corner of this country. Big cities, small towns, and whatever was in between. Looking for the soul of America. And you know what? I found it everywhere. In this episode, we pull the wool over your shoulders in Washougal, Washington, toot our own horns in Elkhart, Indiana, try to keep off the glass, the very beautiful Steuben glass.
So sit back and relax, because we've got it made in America.
This program is produced in cooperation with the Reader's Digest Association.
During the last century, when I was in high school, the really cool guys wore something known as a shirt jack. Now, it wasn't really a shirt, yet it wasn't quite a jacket. Just kind of draped over you, had some buttons, and it was so popular that manufacturers started creating knockoffs. But those in the in crowd, only wore the shirt jack made at Pendleton, here in Washougal, Washington. Today, we're going to see how they make the blanket that put Pendleton on the map, literally.
Washougal is a little bit north and east of Portland, Oregon, on the other side of the Columbia River. It was the first area settled by pioneers in what later became Washington State. Today, about 10,000 people live in this place where Pendleton has been making blankets since 1912. Pendleton's history is a colorful one, literally. The company's roots date to 1863, when Thomas Kay left England for the Pacific Northwest because he'd heard that the climate was perfect for producing wool. It was. And in 1889, he opened his own woolen mill in Salem, Oregon. Most of his family worked in the mill, including oldest daughter Fanny, who married a retail merchant named C.F. Bishop, and in the process gave birth to Pendleton Woolen Mills. 7 generations on, the company is still owned and run by Bishops. About 100 years ago, Pendleton designer Joe Rounsley wanted to capture the flavor, feel, and look of the blankets used by Native Americans. So for long stretches, he'd go off to study them, returning with vivid designs that Pendleton still uses today. The Washougal factory is as colorful as the 300,000 blankets that its 230 artisans produce every year. Our tour guide is Charlie Bishop, great-great-grandson of Thomas Kay, Pendleton's founder.
John, the first thing we do is we take the scoured wool and we load it into a basket and we compress it into a uniform cake so that when we dye it, we get consistent flow throughout that cake and an even distribution of color.
Well, it's more like a donut, isn't it? Because it's got a hole in the middle.
It is more
Well,
of
an
a donut.
angel food cake, they have holes in the
There
middle,
you go.
don't they?
About 250 pounds of wool go into the basket.
Okay, Roberto, you can take a break now. I'll handle this.
Saturated with dye, the wool triples its weight. It's now about 750 pounds.
What is this machine doing?
This is our dryer, and the wool as it comes out of the dye machine has 100 to 200% moisture.
Where's it going? I see it
And
disappearing.
It's going to disappear into a radio frequency dryer where we use radio frequency just like a microwave oven to heat up and exhaust the moisture from the fiber. And so now it's dry. And we dry it to about 18% moisture. And it's very important with wool, which readily accepts and sheds moisture, to not over dry it.
Next, the wool is mixed, as in mixed weave. Then it goes through something called carding.
This is the carding process, and the wool that's been mixed is put into the back of the machine and run through a card. And the card has a bunch of rollers covered with wire that very gently separate. It's a very old process, and the technology really hasn't changed in probably close to 100 years. and somehow the wool magically travels through the machine and comes out the other end.
So the magic has got a lot to do with this process, huh?
Yeah.
This stuff doesn't look or feel anything like the tough wool in those blankets.
You can feel how soft it is.
Boy, that's a pillow right there.
Physics plays a big role.
You can take one of those between your fingers and pull it apart.
Very easily, yeah.
And there's no strength to it. But now grip it between your fingers and twist it, and you interlock those fibers and it becomes yarn and it becomes strong.
Oh, yeah, look at that.
And that's really what textiles are all about. It's interlocking fibers together to produce yarns and fabrics.
This is where the wimpy wool becomes tough textiles.
These machines go on forever, don't they?
The wool does the twist, but this is no dance.
See how much twist there is in the yarn, how it kinks up.
Oh, yeah.
The next
It's
step
like my telephone cord in the kitchen.
and we will actually steam that to set the twist in the yarn so that when we weave it into fabric, it'll behave itself.
Now comes the weaving.
After the yarn has been dressed, we wind it onto a warp beam. These are these large beams that then get picked up and loaded into the back of a weaving machine. And in the weaving machine, the warp yarn gets intersected with the weft yarn, and the yarn becomes fabric.
Warp and weft.
Right, the warp goes up and down, the weft goes back and forth.
You don't have to know your warp from your weft to be impressed by these looms.
That really moves fast.
Yeah, it moves. It goes at about 250 cycles a minute.
The fabric's finishing process begins with an hour's bath in this massive washing machine. After drying, it's then softened and plumped by machines that gently tug at the weave. The blankets get to Lisa just in time.
What does that mean, just in time? What is that?
Well, it means we produce one unit at a time, and they work in a team. And Lisa's going to do the cutting and sewing, and then she'll pass the blanket off to Marlene, who will do the binding. And when Marlene's done, she will pass it off to Terry, who'll do the folding and packaging.
This is dry clean.
Dry clean only. You don't want to throw this in the washing machine with your socks.
No, I wouldn't.
Oh.
It would shrink.
into a handkerchief.
1,000 blankets a day end up like this.
John, these blankets are made to be worn as robes, and so we'd like to wrap you up in a Pendleton Chief Geronimo robe.
When I wander down the driveway this Sunday morning to get my paper.
There you go.
You can get pretty beat walking around this big plant, but there's no better place to take a refreshing break. Bob Krishnak joined me.
Was there always an Indian influence? Did it start out with a Native American influence?
The Native Americans were our very first customers. Blankets are used in their ceremonies from birth to death. When you're born on the reservation, you're given a baby Pendleton blanket. When you graduate from high school, you're given another Pendleton blanket as a sign of rites of passage. When you get married, you and your spouse give back Pendleton blankets to the elders. When you die, you're buried in a Pendleton blanket.
Okay, now what's the one you're lying on, do you know?
I'm lying on our Chief Joseph design. This
Oh, of the Nez Perce.
Of the Nez Perce. This blanket has been in our line since 1924. You know, Nike has Michael Jordan and Tiger Woods as spokesman. We had Chief Joseph and Geronimo as spokesman for Pendleton blankets.
And let's not forget the Beach Boys. Their original name was the Pendletons. Pendleton operates stores all over the country, but it's worth a trip out here to take the visitor's tour before buying something at the shop next door.
This is great.
You're not kidding. Coming up, no wonder revelries played on a trumpet.